those who are here, we read this portion of Philippians earlier, and we're starting today a new sermon series in which we're going to go through the entire book of Philippians together. I'm titling the series, Be Encouraged. And the title for the sermon today is God Will Keep Making Things Better for You. You'll see how I got to that title as we go through it together. You know, Paul wrote this letter for that basic word. He wanted to encourage the believers that lived in ancient Philippi. Like them, we can sort of overhear what he said, because most of us need a word of encouragement as well. You may not know it, but there are two Greek words that get translated encouragement in the New Testament. One, the most common word that is used is parakaleo. Para along the side of, kaleo to call. Whenever you call someone along the side of you, you're simply asking for help. And the person who shows up is referred to in the Bible as the paraclete, the one who comes alongside of. The Holy Spirit is referred to as a paraclete. Jesus is a paraclete. Often those of us get to come and help people. But this idea of someone come along, when you say, hey, I need help, and they show up, you kind of feel encouraged. That's why that word gets translated that way. The other word, which isn't showing up very often, or I should say, we'll back up just a second. Paul used that word parakaleo in several times in the Philippians. In one place, just to give you an example of him using that word, is therefore, if there is any encouragement, parakaleo, in Christ, if there is any consolation of love, if there's any fellowship of the Spirit, any affection and compassion, make my joy complete by being of the same mind, maintaining the same love, united in the same spirit, intent on the same purpose. That other Greek word I was about to tell you about is psycho, which basically, kind of has that psycho word in it. But is good, and psycho is the word for breath. And so you could translate it a couple of different ways. Psycho is also the word for soul. And so you could say it's good for the soul. Or you could translate it makes you breathe easy. It'd be translated either way. Paul told the believers that he hoped Timothy, who he was sending to them, might make them breathe easy, to be encouraged whenever he returned to him with news about their situation. Now, if you're like me, whenever I read a book that's sort of a favorite book, a lot of verses come to mind. And I have a lot of memory verses from the book of Philippians. You might as well. And so here's just some that over the years that I've gotten to know. For me, to live is Christ, and die is gain. I have strength for every situation through him who empowers me. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility value others more than yourselves. Rejoice in the Lord. Again, I say rejoice. As we study through Paul's letter, you might discover or rediscover words that will encourage you, words that you want to put into memory so that you can pull them out and be reminded that God is walking with you. Now, you may not know much about the ancient city of Philippi. Usually that's what we leave for people who really want to get into those things. But since we're going to study this whole book together, I thought I'd give you some context of the people and where they lived at. Back whenever Paul first went to that city, when he arrived to establish the church, there were probably about 10,000 people living in Philippi, which was a pretty good-sized city for back then. It wasn't a whole lot smaller than Los Alamos. However, even though they had 10,000 people, there were not enough Jewish men to form a synagogue. And it only takes 10 men to form a synagogue. And in fact, wherever there were 10 Jewish men, they were required by their understanding of the law of Moses to form a synagogue. And so that's why we know there weren't even 10 of them around, or otherwise there would be a synagogue. And Paul always began his ministry whenever he went to a new city at the synagogue. And there just wasn't one for him to go to. So we know that there weren't many there. So he did the next best thing. He discovered that there were some women who were down by the river on the Sabbath, and they were praying. And so he went and joined them. And he met a gal named Lydia there, and probably several from her household. She had come to believe in God, the God of the Bible, but she wasn't Jewish. And so that's why she couldn't be a part of this. Wasn't a man to make a synagogue, but she was a merchant. She was a seller of purple cloth. She came from what we would call Turkey today. It was in Asia Minor, a city called Thyatira that was known for its textile industry, and in particular for some materials they had there to dye materials in purple, this deep, rich color that they couldn't find anywhere else, and so it was a very expensive garment. It just happens Thyatira, where she was from, was on the border between two regions, one called Lydia, which sounds just like her name, and the other Messiah. So there are some people who think that perhaps her name was sort of a nickname, that she was Lydia, you know, the person from Lydia. Just like we would say, hey, he's Tex, because he's from, well, we know how that works. So it worked the same way back then. You may not know that of those 10,000 people who populated ancient Philippi, only about 20% of them were Romans. That might even be a high estimate. These were the descendants of veterans who had been given land grants about 80 years before, and they handed them down in their families. They had been given these land grants so that they would bring Roman culture into this Macedonian district which they had defeated. All of the people they had defeated got to become their slaves, pretty much. And so they were the dominant people, even though there was a smaller number of them. They primarily spoke in Latin, evidenced by the inscriptions that archaeologists had found. But that larger part of the population, probably about 70% of the population, were those enslaved Macedonians who had lost the war in Rome. They would still speak in their common version of the old language, which was Greek. But under Rome's influence, they were being forced to learn Latin and communicate in Latin, especially for any kind of business. The wealthy land-owning citizens of Rome who lived in Philippi adhered primarily to the imperial cult of Caesar. That is, they believed Caesar was sort of a god. And they actually used phrases that the early Christians would use about Jesus. They would talk about Caesar being Kyrios, Caesar being Lord. They would talk about him being the one who brought them salvation to their life, that is, took care of them in this world. But the slaves, the Macedonians, primarily worshiped Diana. She was the Romanized version of the Greek goddess Artemis. She had all kinds of, sculptures made of her, and they found them in the Acropolis area of Philippi. There were probably some 90 sculptures that they had found there, so they had a bunch of her. She was the goddess of the hunt, and she was the protector of children. But Lydia was not a slave, not Macedonian. She was not one of the rich landowners, but she was like the other merchants in the city that made up the remaining 10%. She was probably had to be a really good merchant because she was a successful merchant in a man's world. And she was a successful merchant in a Roman world. So she was very good at what she did. Paul's message to Lydia and her household that had gathered by the river was sort of like music to her ears. And she, along with the rest of her household, accepted the good news that Paul preached that morning. They were baptized in the river that they had gathered by. And afterwards, she invited Paul and his companions to come and stay in her house, which they did. And from there, the gospel began to spread. Of course, Paul and Silas, that were his traveling companions when he founded that church, kind of got in trouble. They got arrested. They got arrested because there was a girl who was a fortune teller And she was walking around, and he threw out the evil spirit, and she was then unable to tell fortunes anymore. And those who were her masters were upset because now they couldn't make a profit off of her. And then they perceived that perhaps Paul and Silas with this whole Christian thing was going to impact their culture, change their culture, and they didn't want that. And so they had Paul and Silas arrested. And in the middle of the night, there was this huge earthquake that opened the prison's doors. And Paul and Silas recognized that it was not from God. And so they stayed put. And the jailer, who was afraid that he was going to have to kill himself because the prisoners were going to escape, invited Paul and Silas to his house for the night. And he heard the gospel. And he and his household became believers, and they were baptized. Paul and his companions would be asked to leave Philippi, but the damage had been done. The gospel had been planted, and they left behind these people who shared the gospel, and it would impact that ancient city for centuries. It was to this church, this emerging church, mostly of slaves, that Paul wrote these words of encouragement. It seems that the majority of those responding really were from this slave group, because Paul will talk to them in appreciation for the support they sent to him, recognizing that they had little wealth, but they gave from what little they had to what they perceived to be a need greater than their own. We'll learn even more about that generosity as we study through this letter. Paul doesn't reveal where he was imprisoned when he wrote this letter, but the content of this letter leaves little doubt. He was in Rome. He had ended up in prison in Rome because he had appealed to Caesar to settle his case that the Jews had brought against him when he was in Jerusalem. He was a Roman citizen, so he had a right to do that. Now, he used it. He called on this privilege of his to be able to be sent to Rome because the Roman governor of Judea had thought that it was a good idea to turn Paul over to the Jewish people so that they would settle things for Paul. But the previous one had put Paul in prison in Caesarea because it protected him from these very same Jews who really had a plan on silencing Paul's proclamation of the gospel by putting him to death. That's what they wanted to do. So Paul pleaded his case, and as a result of it, he got sent to Caesar. Now, to say that he went through a few adventures on his way to Rome would be an understatement, but we'll save Paul's adventures for another time to get there. But once there, Paul was put into prison, and he stayed in prison waiting for his case to come up to be heard for 2 years. I mean, and you think it takes a long time to get tech help on the phone. You're right, you call and you go, man, I've been here for 20 minutes and I haven't got the response that I wanted. Imagine 2 years. It was during that time that Paul received some of that much needed assistance from the believers in Philippi, which was delivered by a guy that we'll learn more about in this study named Epaphroditus, along with news of what was taking place in Philippi and the spread of the gospel. We'll find in this study that this letter that is called Philippians that was sent back by Paul was probably carried by Epaphroditus along with Timothy. But while he was with Paul, he caught some sort of cold or disease or something that's not described, and he got deathly sick. They thought he was going to die. He did recover, and Paul was eager to send him back home. And he sent Timothy along with him to make sure he got there safe and sound. As we go through this study together, it's going to become abundantly apparent that the believers in Philippi loved Paul. They didn't just like him, they loved him, which was evidenced by the support that they sent to him, which went beyond their own ability. They were also sort of worried about Paul. Sometimes when you love people, you worry about them. They were not worried that he was going to have the right conclusion to his trials. They were just worried that he wasn't going to make it through enduring this captivity in Rome while he waited for the trial to come up. From what we know from history, there were a great many that were sort of in Paul's shoes. They would be sent to Rome to wait for their trial, and the majority of them from these ancient writings say that they died while they were waiting. The conditions were horrible back then for those that were in that situation. Now, granted, we get some idea that Paul could have visitors and they bring help, like Epaphroditus and Timothy, and some even sort of envision it as a home arrest, but Paul talks about himself being in chains. The Philippians, in other words, had good reason to worry about Paul and his health. As we read in the opening sentences of this letter, it's clear that Paul was equally worried about those in Philippi, but for entirely different reasons. He was worried because they were being persecuted by those who opposed the gospel message, like those who originally threw Paul into jail, but they needed to be able to persevere against it. And they really did feel that the gospel was subversive because it challenged and it threatened to change culture, and that it pointed to a better way of living. You know, the church is still sort of seen that way. We're seen as something subversive because we point to a better way than the world is living, and they don't always like having that better way pointed out. Paul was also worried that false teachers would infiltrate their meetings at the church as they had in other places, and they would need to be able to defend the gospel. There were believers who advocated that the real change that these Gentile believers needed was to accept Jewish customs and culture. But Jesus often pointed out, especially in his Sermon on the Mount, that that's not always the case. You remember he kept saying, "You've heard it said, but I say it to you." What they needed was to remain faithful to the gospel so that its truth would transform them into people of love, and then they could in turn transform their society. Paul was also worried about quarrels between members of the church. He had heard about them, and he was afraid it was going to divide them, and that divided church would not have the same impact and witness as a united church is. Resolving differences between members is never an easy task. In fact, he pointed out, and we're going to study more on it, that it really takes humility, which is often a rare quality even in the church today. It is easier to leave a church and go to another whenever conflicts arise rather than staying and having the humility to work things through. Paul addressed all of these worries in this letter, and he did so in a way that encouraged them, and it should encourage us when we face similar situations. Timothy, who gets mentioned at the beginning of this letter, it says from Paul and Timothy, was with Paul in his Roman imprisonment. He probably acted as the scribe, the person who wrote down this letter. And he would be the one traveling with Epaphras who would actually carry the letter with him back to Philippi. And usually that's the way they sent letters. So if anybody had any questions about it, Timothy could say, well, this is what Paul meant. This is what he was talking about. They didn't have to have a commentary. They had one that showed up with it in the person of Timothy. But Timothy also had this special relationship with Paul. You'll find it spread out through the entire New Testament. He wasn't just a student of the Word. He didn't just show up at the church and say, hey, I really got to study the Bible. He was sort of like a disciple of Paul. He traveled with Paul and he learned from Paul. He shared life with Paul. He sort of represented that next generation of those who would advance the gospel whenever those who were old like Paul had already been used to God's glory. And Paul thought of Timothy like a son. Paul didn't have his own kids, but when he thought of Timothy, he thought kid. He loved him like a parent loves a son, and he took care of him and raised him as one would raise a son. And he was proud of him whenever he went out to accomplish the successes that he was doing. They shared life together, and those common experiences drew them closer and closer together. I'll be honest, it's hard to get close to someone if you don't share common experiences together. In fact, one of the things I get to do as a pastor, it's not my favorite thing to do, but often whenever couples are thinking about a divorce, I often get called on to help them work through it. And one of the common themes is very often they quit sharing life experiences together. They live in the same house, but they don't do the same things. They don't share the same issues. They don't go to the same places. It's like they live separate, completely lives, even though they're in the same thing. And then all of a sudden they're confused on why they feel like they've been drawn apart. We need to share experiences together, to grow through them together. Not only those who are married, but even those as a part of the church. You know, if as a church we only show up here on Sunday and we just sort of say hi and bye to each other and we never have any shared life experiences, it's going to be real hard for us to grow closer together. Paul's message of encouragement contained in this letter, he said, wasn't just for the elders and the deacons, the leaders that had been raised up in that church that he had planted, but it was for everyone. It was for everyone because everyone faced these same problems. And they all needed to be encouraged. They needed that breath of fresh air. They needed that person who came to their aid. It was an open letter. And so I want you to hear this letter as a letter to you. Paul enjoyed the precious memories of those shared experiences when he established the church, and we have recorded in the book of Acts. But he also enjoyed a current relationship in which was maintained, not because they were together, but it was maintained because they shared news back and forth that these people were carrying back and forth with these letters. In some ways, they were sort of like pen pals. What Paul heard about their situation, we find in these opening words, led him to ask God to parakaleo them, to help them, to encourage them. And Paul did what he could to do that by primarily sending Timothy along with this letter to go there and be with them. And they had done the same, primarily in that person of Epaphroditus, sending him to encourage Paul. They enjoyed what Paul called a fellowship of the gospel. That is, they were both doing what God called them to do. They were both spreading the good news in each their own places. But they were also encouraging one another by what they heard the other person was doing. You know, it's encouraging to hear what God is doing in someone else's life. So we need to get better at sharing our stories with one another about what God is doing in our lives. So even though we might not have that shared experience together, at least like Paul in the Philippian church, we can have this fellowship of the gospel when we share our stories with each other. We need to be able to say things about, hey, you're not going to believe what happened to me the other day. Marcy noticed on a Facebook post that Amy, someone who used to live here, is taking care of her husband, Carl. And he's got brain cancer, and he's on hospice, and it's gotten so bad that she can't leave his side, and she's been with him for an entire week, and she can't get away for anything. And so Marcy, being a good friend, said, Doug will come down. So I did. I assumed that was God's moving through my wife. At first I said, man, I got all this stuff I need to do tomorrow. And then so I decided, all that stuff's really not that important. And so I got up and went down there, and it was pretty easy. You know, I hung up some rails in her bathroom. But mostly I sat with Carl and talked with him and the way he's able to do so now. While she was able to go and get some blood work done, some things, go by the store, stuff that she just couldn't go out and do. That's a gospel kind of experience. I'll be honest, I was also blessed with it because I am at that age where I set things down. I don't remember where I set them at all the time. And since I've had my cataract surgery, I have to have readers or I can't read stuff up close. I'm learning to depend on those. And I had set them down in his house and I couldn't find them. And so I was sort of going, where are they at? And he noticed this and he said, hey, Doug, when I lose things, I just immediately ask God to help me find them because he's good at finding lost things. Have you asked God to help you find those glasses? I'm the preacher. Dear God, help me find my glasses. And he did. It was a good time. We need to be able to share those stories with each other so that we get this sense of shared life with one another. One of the ways that we've been trying to encourage that to happen is through this Faith Life program that we keep pushing, because it's a way that's like a Facebook post, but you just share it. It's just within the church, and you can put in stories of saying, hey, let me tell you what happened today. And most of us kind of like to be those who look at someone else's posts rather than putting our information out there. But we've got to figure out whether it's on that or some other way to let people know what's going on and what God is doing in each of our lives so that we can share it and live it together. You see, what Paul heard about the believers in Philippi and the good things they were doing made him confident. He said that God, who began a good work among them when that church was planted, would bring it to the proper end. He uses the word teleos, which means to come to maturity in its completeness. It's kind of like if you talk about a seed, and its maturity, completeness is whenever that seed gets planted and it grows into a tree and it finally bears fruit. It does what it was intended to do. And Paul is saying, hey, God who started this good work in you, he's going to see it to the end. You're going to bear fruit too. Even though right now you're faced with some daunting issues, God's going to be with you every step of the way. You're not just going to survive it. You're going to thrive in it. Paul said that it was only proper for him to feel this way about them because, well, they'd stuck with him through thick and thin. They had not only supported him during his imprisonment, they had not only resonated with his defense of the gospel, but they also received with him God's outpouring of his mercy and his grace into their lives, just as he was receiving it, because they were sharing life together. Paul compared his feelings toward these believers to Christ's compassion to those he loved. And this term that Paul uses for compassion actually means the guts. You know what it's like to hear about someone and you're so moved by it, you feel it in your guts? I hope you've felt something so strongly. That's how Paul felt about these believers in Philippi. His feelings led him to ask God to bring about what was best for them in his prayers. He worded it this way. You'll probably recall this from the words that were read earlier. He says, God, I want their love to abound. A word for overflowing. When you fill up a cup and it runs over. I want their love to be like that. It just sort of sloshes out of their life. I want it to happen more and more. I want their understanding of your truth to grow deeper and deeper. You know why our understanding of the truth needs to grow deeper? Think about a plant. A plant that has its roots deep, where it can access water whenever there seems to be this dryness on the surface. Those plants that have those deep, deep roots survive. And he wanted them to have that understanding, that relationship with God that was this deep, deep experience so they could get through those times that just seemed like they were dry. He wanted them to have a discernment of how to put it into practice. to discern how to live life for Christ. You know, the Bible doesn't always have a thus saith the Lord for every situation that we find ourselves in. I mean, it would be nice. You know, we could pull out our phone and say, hey, I got this situation right here going on, God. Where's the verse? I need a thus saith the Lord so I know exactly what I'm supposed to do. But it doesn't work that way. So he wanted them to have this discernment, to see the needs in people, to recognize what was taking place, and to respond to them in that situation as Christ would respond to it. What a beautiful prayer. It's the kind of prayer that we need to be praying for each other. Paul was certain that as that kind of prayer was answered in their lives, that it would lead them to embrace a way of living that wasn't just best, but was excellent. God's way always is. And it would also lead them to bear the fruit of righteousness. The fruit of righteousness is the kind of good things that happen when you do the right thing. And when you follow God, you're going to end up doing the right thing. He said, I want that to be happening in your life so when Judgment Day comes, and this is sort of a paraphrase on my part from the text, that they would hear Jesus say, well done, good and faithful servant. This, Paul thought, is really what happens when you follow Jesus. Your life really does get better, and you end up making the lives of the people around you better. And what happened in ancient Philippi is what's going to happen here in Los Alamos when we, like they did, faithfully follow Jesus. You know, it's been said that taking one step won't lead you very far. You've got to keep putting that next foot in front of the other. It's been said that one word won't explain how the gospel has changed your life. You've got to keep on speaking to share the whole story. Just as doing one good thing won't evidence that you're really following Jesus, you've got to keep on keeping on doing those good things. And like these ancient believers in Philippi, sometimes we need a little encouragement, a little motivation to keep on doing so. And when we share life in Christ, we'll get that motivation. When we hear each other's stories and we recognize that God is doing amazing things for the lives of one another in everyday situations, we'll be more and more motivated, more and more encouraged to live that way too. I hope from our beginning of our study together that you hear a word of encouragement for yourself. A word that says, keep going. God is with you. He is going to see you through it. And then you can use that to encourage those around you. We're going to have a hymn of invitation